I married a guy I knew most of my life. We knew each other in high school and even went to prom together. But little did I know, I did not know him at all. I will call my now ex-husband Dirty Chad.
Hey y'all, this is April.
And this is Caroline.
With Bloody Happy Hour.
And we are bringing to you Dirty Chad. Get it on patreon.com/bloodyhappyhour exclusively for all the details and all the red flags.
Caroline's finally telling her story.
My truth.
This is a Rogue Media Network podcast. The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewing on Historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos at Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos at Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Okay, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. This episode is an extension of an earlier interview I did with Dr. Kenneth Hafertepe of the Museum Studies Department at Baylor University, a well-published author, and one area of his publishing has been on buildings in Waco. And so we had Historic Homes of Waco, and then he has recently published Historic Buildings of Waco. And so we had a part one where we began to go through the book. So stop now if you have not listened to part one and go back and do that. But Ken and I are going to pick up our conversation as we were kind of working through the book. I would encourage you to pick it up. It's a great book, great looking book, whether you're interested in it for reference or put it on your coffee table, whatever you want to use it for. It's Historic Buildings of Waco, Texas. Kenneth Hafertepe, and in the pipeline is more Historic Homes of Waco, Texas.
That is correct.
Right,
yes.
And so if folks are marking their calendars, when should they expect to hold that book?
Well, all I know is what Mr. Amazon tells me.
Okay. And what does he say?
And Mr. Amazon says February 23rd.
February 23rd.
I don't know how he came up with that. But,
okay.
But Mr. Amazon never lies.
Okay. So just in time for leap year.
Right.
You'll be able to read Ken's third book.
Exactly.
On Waco.
Yeah, and the buildings book actually came out a week before Mr. Amazon's estimated date. So.
All right, so it happens. That is an unpaid endorsement of Amazon. Okay, well, as we were working our way through, we had you chose to organize the book less by period and more by type of structure. And so we're kind of working our way, although there is an organization within the chapters that is periodized.
Yeah, it just made sense to group it by building types because once you do that, you are able to make more meaningful comparisons with other buildings of the same type. So yeah, and then you can sort of see the evolution within commercial buildings or manufacturing buildings or whatever.
Well, that's a great setup because we were about to start talking about Chapter 3, wholesale and manufacturing. A lot of these buildings folks are familiar with. Most of them have been repurposed in some way, but they're still a vibrant part of the city landscape. So I'm interested, Ken, just some of these are very familiar buildings, but maybe some things you discovered in researching for this chapter that were less known to you.
Well, it's interesting, for one thing, to think about the fact that so many of these buildings were right in the path of the tornado in 1953. Thinking of the what's now the Dr. Pepper Museum, the Artesian Manufacturing and Bottling Company, on the Waco north side of the building, there's a change in brick which reflects the gash that was created by the tornado in 53. And if you move from there to the next one, it's the McClendon Hardware Company, which most of us know as River Square Center, so that we could put in some commercial placement for various restaurants that we like and all. But the thing that's striking about that was that it was severely damaged by the tornado, that the top floor of the building was removed, and in addition to that, most of the ornament that was on that side. And when it was adapted to become the group of restaurants and shops that it has, it's interesting that it ended up being flipped to what had been the alley side of the complex, became the front of the complex. Originally, the front of the building was actually on the west side, which is now the side of a lovely Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, so Mary
Yes.
Avenue was once the
Right,
frontage.
and Mary had the railroad tracks, which was so critical in most of these buildings because they wanted deliveries of goods in, and if they're shipping to other locations. And so that Mary was the secondary one, and I guess that's 3rd Street. That was the pedestrian entrance, shall we say? And no one, very few people remember, but originally where the parking lot is for that complex now, that was actually a block. It had a hotel on it and other buildings, and so there was just a narrow alley that separated that from McClendon Hardware. So by the time that this was adapted in 1995, 97, I don't know if it's the entirety that had been cleared away, probably part of the urban renewal that had happened in the 60s and early 70s. But they were able to create a whole new set of entrances and the sort of shady front porch of the building. So, it's very successful in terms of the way it was adapted. It doesn't give you much of a clue as far as what the building was originally like.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it does give a sense of, even as you say that, I'm looking at the picture, I think taken by Kenneth Hafertepe.
I think that's a fair assertion.
In the book. Also, contributed all the images in the book. You can kind of look at the back side of it on Mary and notice it's a fairly ornate back side of a building that does suggest the fact that this was the frontage at one point on that building.
Yeah, you can actually flip between that and the previous one, the Dr. Pepper Museum, and there's a grand arch, and that was the railroad entrance side
I see.
On Mary as well. So, and the architect is the same, Milton W. Scott. And the way that it worked out in the adaptation, there's now fencing that hides the dumpsters and coolers for alcoholic drinks and things like that, which you got to do what you got to do, but it's dramatically different. That grand arch that you can see on the right side of that photo was really the architect's way of emphasizing the importance of that entrance into the building. In terms of all the goods that were coming in. Yeah. Because this was basically retail and wholesale hardware company.
Yeah. I do want to ask while I'm looking at the Artesian Manufacturing Bottling Company building, and you may or may not know the answer to this question, but obviously when folks talk about the tornado, they talk about the different colored brick. Was that an inability to find matching brick, or was that an intentional choice? I've heard both in choosing to come back with that different colored brick in the reconstruction.
Yes, it definitely is a different color, and I'm not sure whether that was intentional or whether it was, what the heck, this somewhat matches. I like it in the sense that it does acknowledge the history of the building and what it's gone through, and reminds us how amazing its renaissance and reuse as a museum actually is. In the research for the book, I was able to dig down enough to find out that the brick that was used on the building is actually from Elgin, east of Austin, which became in the first decade of the 20th century became a brick making locale. So if this building had been built 10 years earlier, it would have had a different looking color brick because it was not commercially available. at this point. So it's interesting finding out little details like that.
Yeah.
And the building was also illustrated in an industry journal called I think it's like the Southern Carbonator or something like that.
I get that. I get
Which
the Southern Carbonator.
yes, I think I've noticed that in the outer office of the Institute for Oral History. But the thing that was striking about it is that it actually includes Milton Scott's original plans for the layout of the first, second, and third floors, and so it's really interesting. A lot of original fabric is retained on the inside, but in the way that it's been adapted over the years, you really don't get a sense of how it functioned as a building on the inside. And so the type of architectural historian that I am, I'm interested in what makes it a distinctive building, what makes it a beautiful building, but I also want to know what makes it work. So things like, the secondary entrance on the Mary side and there was actually, decking on that side so that the train cars could just roll right up to it. But the pedestrian entrance, when you came in from the Fifth Street side, to the immediate right, there was actually a corner office. It sounds like it's going to be in a skyscraper or something, but it's actually the first floor of the Dr. Pepper building was the president's office. So that corner office was considered prestigious even then. And there was actually a large safe for all the funds of the company adjoining that space too. So it's interesting to me. Trying to find out more about how it worked, also how it was put together, where did things come from, and so when you can get that level of detail, it can be more interesting than simply dwelling on, what particular type of column is used or something like that.
So that connective thread of adaptive reuse that we see in a lot of these buildings. River Square Center, kind of the repurposing of that building, I really see that historically as the beginning of kind of the renaissance of downtown, it seemed. Would you agree based on your research?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that there had been such a turning away from downtown in the 60s and 70s. And, driven by, a lot of the government ideology of urban renewal and that anything was old was expected to be slums or substandard or the like. And why don't we build something new? I think there was a sort of arrogance to that and an unwillingness to see the good that was in the past. So it was a progressive movement, but not one that was willing to appreciate the past. So I'm glad that that project came along, and it certainly has led the way for a lot of important Waco shifting projects like the silos,
which is in this chapter as well. The old Brazos Valley cotton oil mill.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'd known about the cotton oil mill. I did not know until I started doing research for this that it actually had been a sort of retail lumber location in downtown Waco. And I knew that area to the southwest of the sort of central business district had a lot of things like, the lumber yard for the Cameron Company and a lot of the other
because again, right by the railroad.
Right. Yeah. That the same strategic advantage that you had there. So there's a weird sense in which that original business was lumber, but it was also prefab doors and windows and all sorts of things to build your house, which seems to anticipate what happens in the long run with Magnolia coming in there as well. So I'm glad that they were able to save as many of the original buildings that they did. And of course, this was something that was done with some of the city's tax increment fund monies. I think it's like $250,000, which now seems like quite a bargain to kick that in to see if we can jumpstart the Waco economy, which it certainly succeeded in doing. And because of that, the public funding there, it allowed the Texas Historical Commission to come in and advise. And so that was an important aspect too, that the historic preservation laws in Texas tend to be fairly light, no onerous burdens for property owners if at all possible. But when there's public funding involved in it, that does activate best practices, shall we say, in terms of how you can respectfully deal with old buildings without without making it completely impractical for a modern business, as the case of Magnolia, or the or completely transforming it. I mean, the biggest change in the main structure that's now the Magnolia Market was that they painted the whole thing white. And, it was kind of a dreary concrete block. I mean, it was a workaday building. Yeah. And so just to be able to make that point, I think is useful, that, sometimes these buildings were not intended to be something to look at. And so there's this way in which what Magnolia and the Texas Historical Commission were able to work out is a good compromise. It sort of moves their brand forward, but it also is respectful of the footprint of the building, and the material stayed the same. And, it works quite nicely. Yeah, and then they allowed the later built silos to antique, if it were. Yes, that's kind of when that happened, I seem to recall that there was some concern on people's part that the buildings remaining unpainted were going to rust away. And there goes our new symbol of Waco's prosperity in the early 20th century. It did strike me too that, if the city was willing to help pay for it, that might be foolish to not take the city up on that. But as far as I know, nothing has been done or nothing has been allowed to happen that's going to be irreversible, shall we say? So we'll just have to keep our eye on that. So another building I want to get your thoughts on. It's one of my favorite little buildings. Is tucked away on 9th Street. Is the Texas Telephone Company Exchange building, which has an incredible frontage. I mean, the facade of it is really it's also a good demonstration of how you save money on the back. Yes. But I'm interested in your research on that building, what you discovered about it. I agree with you that it is striking, the shift from the fancy brick that's on the front 4 bays and then on the first bay to the rear. And I think it was designed with the anticipation that the rest of that block, that there would probably be an alley there, but that there was I don't think they had any notion that there was going to be a parking lot there, and that the whole darn side with the cheap brick was going to become as prominent as it has. And this is an interesting. One of the things that I've enjoyed about the Waco project is it's taken me out of, I won't say my comfort zone, but the time period that I've tended to work on, which tends to be early Texas and early America, particularly the 19th century. And to actually be writing about things like early telephone exchanges is cool, or early gas stations or automobile showrooms, which, just completely inconceivable in Waco in the 1850s or 1860s. But to see his history roaring into the 20th century was quite interesting. So just in terms of that building, it was really kind of striking that the way in which the building was divided was actually divided by gender. That the second floor of this 3-story building had all of the technology and the mechanicals, and that was the male floor. And above that, on the 3rd floor, that was the operating room, which was the switchboards. So all of those photos that you see in Waco and elsewhere of all the young women sitting and connecting the lines from one caller to another, this is where that was happening. And I don't know that anyone really thinks about that anymore.
Yeah.
You know, you just drive by and it's an old building. But so it's interesting to know that, and also that they actually had a small cafe on that floor and a restroom, and that there was even a rooftop garden, which seems like a pretty nice amenity for people who are working for the phone company. The interesting thing too is that in the photo that I took for that, you can just see the yellow brick of the later Southwestern Bell telephone building, which basically supplanted that building, but it was still part of the telephone network. But that building from the 1950s, which is now owned by McLennan County, actually made it. That was when the technology was first put into place to have dial telephones.
Okay.
So that you did not need to call the operator and ask for somebody else's extension or something like that.
Yeah.
And you know, now that's become completely obsolete in and of itself. It's its own period statement. But just interesting to see the way in which the buildings and the additional buildings are related to technological developments.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, now that's the McLennan County Archive. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other wholesale and kind of manufacturing structures that you want to highlight?
Oh, there's so many.
We can't do all of them. We can't do all of them.
One thing that strikes me, and you know, I don't know if I'm an old Wacoan. I'm old and live in Waco, but
you've been here a little. You've been here a minute.
I've
Ken.
been here 23 years, and you know, I'm sure there's still people who consider me a newcomer. But everyone in Waco knows the complex off of LaSalle Avenue as being the LL Sam's building, and I was completely startled to find when I started doing the research on that was originally a cotton mill.
Yeah.
It was like, what? And this was a building that was first erected 1919, 1920. And then in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it becomes adapted to become a manufacturing company for pews and pulpits and basically church furniture. And now has been adapted once again into loft apartments for students at Baylor. And on the top of the tower, it actually still says Miller Cotton Mill on it, and it's white on white, so it's kind of hard to read. But that, I wasn't sure how much I was going to have to say about that building, but then it turned out there was that, but there was also the fact that it was actually a design build project for a guy from Fort Worth named Wyatt C. Hedrick, and Hedrick, about this time, became a partner of Sanguinet and Stats, the skyscraper firm from Fort Worth, who designed the Alico building and a few other buildings here in Waco. And so it ended up becoming Sanguinet, Stats, and Hedrick. And he basically, they were looking to retire, and so he was the heir apparent to the business. But he ended up being an architect and builder in Fort Worth. Was very involved in construction of the Texas Tech University campus up in Lubbock, and was actually pulled in to another project here in Waco, which is the Armstrong Browning Library.
Oh.
And that is a long story in and of itself, but Dr. Armstrong had been hoping to have architects from the East Coast. He had talked with John Russell Pope, a very prominent architect who had done the National Gallery of Art and the National Archives building. But they needed to have someone who was a Texas architect to be sort of the name on the project. So Wyatt C. Hedrick was brought in, and a lot of the exterior design of the building looks like his, but then the inside actually looks more like buildings that you might see, the National Gallery or something like that. So finding those sort of interconnections of unlikely places of there is a connection between the L.L. Sam's building and the Armstrong Browning Library.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty crazy to
Yeah,
me.
that's really interesting. Yeah, I know that cotton mill was an anchor for the Edgefield community and neighborhood that was right out there. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's we can't give it all away because you're asking folks to pay
I know.
for it. Yeah.
Run out and buy it, folks.
Yeah, let's jump to skyscrapers. Now we are in our last episode, because it is our home of Rogue Media Studios. We kind of talked about the Alico building. What is the second tallest building in Waco?
I don't know.
Ken, come on.
Do you know the answer, or
I don't think it's. I don't. I think it may be the Riggs. Which
that is to say,
the Raleigh,
the
Riggins,
the
which
Riggins, the
becomes
Raleigh, the whatever.
Yeah,
That's pretty tall,
Yeah.
and also the Liberty Bank building.
yeah.
Which
And the Roosevelt.
Yes. So those are the three next ones.
Yeah.
And then actually the Medical Arts building, I think, may overtake them in 1927, 29.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to sit here and count stories on
I did.
And the Medical Arts building is interesting in that it actually has some attempt at the sculptural interest of a lot of East Coast skyscrapers, where there was a lot of concern that if you were just going to have simple up-down buildings with a flat top, that that was going to not that it would throw too much of a shadow, and that there just was not going to be enough interest if all of these buildings were repeating the same format. And you can see on the Medical Arts building, which has more recently been the National Lloyd's building, that it's actually set back on 3 of the 4 sides, so that at the upper level there were these fairly large balconies for the people enjoying a Waco evening to step out on. And so it's been through some unsympathetic changes over the years. It was one of the saddest examples of ripping out the original windows and putting in the blank reflective glass there, which just sort of gives it kind of a dead-eyed look, which actually is true as well of the Liberty Bank building. There's something about the scale of those original windows on any building, really, that gives it a lot of its character. And I think that for both of these buildings, this sort of solid panes of glass is sort of what renovators were doing in the age of urban renewal. That if we're not going to tear this down, we might as well make it look modern. And so the less it had to do with the original appearance, the better, I think, is what they were really thinking.
Yeah, and a lot of this construction, of course, the Alico is the earliest, and a lot of this is the 20s.
Yes.
Where they're building these larger structures.
Yeah, and I was actually, just out of the nature of this project, there's one photo per building, unless there was a little extra space. And that was sort of my way of disciplining myself of not having too darn many photos and having my editors at A&M Press scowl at me. But every now and then there are situations where if I had been able to tuck in one more photograph, the First National Bank building, which is now owned by the Baylor University and houses the School of Social Work, the complex that you see right here, which is also Wyatt C. Hedrick again, just about the same time he was working on Armstrong Browning Library. The original notion was that what's the First National Bank building was going to be part of a 3-part building, which is going to have its tower in the center, sort of interrupting a low level on both sides. It was actually linked to the design of the Secretariat building of the United Nations in New York City.
Okay.
And I did my best to clearly describe that to the visitor, but one picture of the original drawing, which was in the papers at the time, and then seeing that the First National Bank is the one fragment that was built, I guess they ran out of money and they decided, well, we'll wait until next year or next decade. And by the time next year and next decade came around, it ended up becoming something completely different, the First National Bank office building, designed by local architects. So it's hard to imagine that unless you've really seen that photo.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
one of these days.
Yeah, and I think, this is development that starts in the 50s.
Mhm.
Historically, downtown's not doing very well by the time you get to the late 1950s.
Yeah. And this was actually the First National Bank building was the first to have a drive-in tellers.
Uh-huh.
And they're actually still extant on the back side of the building. So if you're ever on the Washington side and looking towards it across another fine Waco parking lot, you can see that. And obviously they've not been used in many, many years, but it's intriguing to find those sort of survivals from the building. And also, that was an indication of the way in which Americans were really becoming wedded to their automobiles in the 50s.
Yeah.
So even though, there's a sense that this is a bold statement, a vote for downtown at a time when people were saying, run away, run away. It's still trying to accommodate to the auto and to other types of modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. All right, well, let's jump to the public buildings chapter, and of course, you use a loophole here to fit the suspension bridge in there, because you can't have a book without the suspension bridge in it.
Yes, where do you put it if you don't?
Put it as a public building. This is something I know that you were familiar with, but what did you discover in researching it this time?
Well, the thing that struck me about this that tends not to be in the 5 things that you hear about the building over and over and over again is the fact that it's really the creation of 2 completely separate building campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was very confused walking over the bridge for many years with my dogs, Genevieve and Rascal. And they and I noted that the steel frame on it was marked inland steel. And that always, there was a cognitive dissonance to that for me in the sense that when was inland steel founded and how did that end up on this bridge? Well, it turned out that was part of phase 2. And that what we see there, the whole series of struts running across the bridge are actually from 1914. And that the sidewalks that are hanging out on each side from that are also from 1914. So it was a much simpler bridge in terms of numbers of lanes. And, basically in 1914, they're trying to make it continue to be usable.
Yeah.
The only reason they were able to do that was that in 1910, they just built the Washington Avenue Bridge. So that once Washington Avenue was open, okay, let's start working on the suspension bridge.
Which is the first automobile bridge.
Yes.
So they're retrofitting it in some ways
Right.
for automobile traffic.
Yes. And at the other thing that happened at the time that they were redesigning the bridge was that a lot of what architectural historians like to call the form-giving elements were removed from the original design, which is to say that you can see at the top of the 2 piers that frame the arches at each end, it's a sort of simple cap that flares out at a couple of points. But on the original bridge, it really was a medieval revival look to it, which had crenellation, like you expected, men in armor with their long bows hopping up to shoot somebody or defend alike. So that sort of medievalism, which was also incorporated in the fact that it was not plastered originally.
Yeah.
So that the original bridge had its suspension wires, but there was the feel of the brick, and it was very much a local brick. That was brick that was made by William Barry Trice and his brother Slaon Trice, and by John Wesley Mann. And that actually helped sort of build their fortunes in early Waco and led to things like East Terrace, the building. But there was also there was an architectural ideology that goes back to England and John Ruskin, and the notion of truth to materials and not hiding what you build with, and that you should make buildings that make the structure ornamental, not add ornament to the structure. So that was this Victorian notion of what makes a building truthful. And so, and you can see in the photo in the book that the base underneath the bridge is still truthful. And that you can see the original Waco bricks, but above that, it ends up getting regularized through the plaster and through the caps that replace the battlements up at the top and the like. And there was even a middle point in which the towers became billboards. And, it was Bull Durham being advertised there and things of that nature. And I think once you went from the sort of medievalism to the commercialism, probably by 1914, they thought the progressive thing to do is just plaster over it rather than try to take it back to some cleaner version of itself. So all of this, made me more tolerant, I guess you'd say, of what had to be done to restore the building for the next century. Because things had to be done, and it's not the bridge that I used to walk over with Genevieve and Rascal. But of course, even that bridge wasn't the bridge. We were walking on planks of wood that, they look very old. They look like they might be original. And it's like, well, yeah, they're original to 1914. But as you were saying, the attempt to make it safe for automotive traffic, that was actually a wood base, which was then paved over on top of that. So that wood had never been intended to be exposed in the first place. So, so in that regard, the nostalgic bridge that I remember of 2000 to 2010 or whatever was, a creature of its time, but definitely not original. So, we did what we needed to do to make it functional going forward into the future. And hopefully there'll be many generations that pass before we have to do that again.
Well, it's been nice to see it open up again. And definitely a lot of traffic on it. People are out enjoying it, and this new hope for Bridge Street, I think, it'll remain central in the life of the town, which is great. Let's see some other. Tell me about Waterworks.
The Waterworks. Somehow my book just opened to that page immediately. That was another one where there was a certain level in which there was the same 5 things that were always said about it, but it was a struggle to find what was the 6th and 7th thing that had never been said. And it wasn't until very late in the process, actually, that I found a very useful article it was in another one of those, it's not exactly a trade publication, but a publication for commissioners of waterworks or something like that had a very nice, informative article by one of our locals, William Markham Sleeper, who was the first chairman of the Water Commission. And he cleared up a lot of the mysteries, and it's just not been referred to ever since then. As no one knows when this was built or what. And he sort of lays out that there was an attempt at a commercial company, the Bell Water Company, that initially was on the site, but it was a temporary structure, and really, other than occupying the same site, not even necessarily the same footprint, did not have much to do with the building that ended up being completely replaced in 1904 by the city of Waco. So that this doesn't have anything to do with J.D. Bell's waterworks, but it is in fact a pretty impressive building, although, once again, we see Waco buildings passing through time and strange things happen to them, like the railroad caboose that's sticking out of...
I assume that was a crash and crush sort of incident.
Yes, I guess that might have been the illusion that was going on there. I think I've only been in the building once when it was a restaurant, but it seems that many people do remember when it was a restaurant or a bar. And in fact, one of the artifacts of that phase of the water pumping station is that on many a night, drunk young men had to take it outside if they were going to fight each other, and went across the street to East Terrace, which was distressing to the board of the Historic Waco Foundation, because we don't want young men fighting on our grounds. And so that's the reason that there is that fence around East Terrace. It is nothing that had anything to do with the Mann family. It's an artifact of the restaurant bar that was across the street in recent times. That's really a challenge because again, the landscaping of East Terrace, we're basically missing the terraces, but it did terrace down to the river, and the modern road that runs right by that completely obliterates the relationship of the house to the river.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
oh well.
Yeah. And who knows what the Waco water pumping station might become next. Someone with deep pockets needs to do something about that. I've always thought our city hall is fascinating, just the way they worked in it, the hope to get a local company to do the work, and it became political, I know, but tell a little bit of that story.
Yeah. The whole thing is interesting, dating back well before this building, because of the fact that in Waco, the center of the town square is occupied by the city hall rather than the courthouse.
Yeah,
and the courthouse was shunted off to one side. It actually was where the parking lot of the Hilton Hotel was, at Second and Franklin. So there was a very nice Victorian courthouse there, but I don't know to what degree the lynching of Jesse Washington had anything to do with a feeling that we needed to move on and have a new courthouse, because that had happened just out the northeast corner of the courthouse square.
Well, that lynching was with the new courthouse. I mean, the current courthouse is where that trial occurred of Jesse Washington.
Yeah, the trial occurred in
but the city
county
hall
courthouse.
was the desire for a new city hall could have been connected to that.
Yeah. Well, the trial occurred at the courthouse, and then he was taken to the town square to be lynched.
Yeah, right outside City Hall.
So so it's interesting. The courthouse doesn't seem to be quite as implicated, but it's kind of interesting to look at the city hall as, sort of the Art Deco or Art Moderne style, and it's of its own generation, kind of a let's move past this old-fashioned Victorian, let's have something bold and modern, and it's actually an early, I was surprised that it was built as early as it was, 1929-30. I've looked at that many times and thought, it looks like what's sometimes referred to as stripped classicism, or a classicism that's simplified because of the Great Depression. And, this was designed just before the Depression. And so really it's an early example of this, which is intriguing. And the architect was someone who was local in the sense that I guess he had been there about the same amount of time I have been in Waco. But Harry L. Spicer came to Waco and was both an architect and a structural engineer, and ended up working on quite a few well-known Waco buildings. He was a structural engineer for Waco Hall on the Baylor campus. He designed the First National Bank, not the First National Bank, the City National Bank, that's on Fifth Avenue, the Austin Avenue, the 500 block. The Stratton Furniture Store is his. So there's a whole series. So this is the first time, this book is the first time that anyone's discussed his work as a coherent whole. And, I'm trying to make the connections from entry to entry of other buildings that each architect has done. So Spicer was someone who was, he was sort of the successor to Milton Scott of being the practical businessman as architect.
Yeah.
That he was very keen to make sure that a building was presentable, what the client was hoping for, and not over budget.
Yeah.
And sometimes architects can dream a little too big and can end up being challenged there. But Spicer was very much the businessman's architect.
A couple other buildings that are federal buildings that I think people don't necessarily know as much of the history of that you've included here and done good service in doing it is the VA hospital, the Veterans Administration Hospital, and the federal building, or the U.S. courthouse, which was the post office at one point. But if you can talk a little bit about those buildings.
Yeah. The Waco Veterans Administration Hospital, which is now the Doris Miller Medical Center, is an interesting story. This is another one where just eyeballing it, I misdated it. Much like the City Hall, where it looked to be 1939 and it was actually 1929. And I always looked at the VA hospital complex, which is this beautiful arrangement of buildings with red tile roofs and the like, and thought, oh, well, this is obviously something that's New Deal. It's Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal coming in and trying to spend us out of the Great Depression. Actually, this complex was started during the administration of Herbert Hoover, who was very concerned by the number of veterans coming back from World War I with shell shock, which was the period term for post-traumatic stress. So he initiated a campaign of construction of veterans hospitals throughout the United States, all of them designed in Washington, D.C., and hopefully with some sort of style that was appropriate for the region where it was serving. And it was, in fact, the beneficiary of spending under the New Deal, but that was some of the later buildings behind it that kept building in the original style.
Yeah.
So it's a complex that has a very consistent style to it and is really quite a pleasure to walk around it. And I really had never gotten around to doing it until it was like, well, I'd better write something for this chapter, and was blown away just walking around and examining the different buildings. This is probably a case where it would have been very easy to have 10 or 12 photographs of the various buildings because they're quite nice. It's also significant in that it was the first National Register of Historic Places, historic district in the city of Waco.
Oh, wow.
And, it predated the downtown Waco district or the Castle Heights district. And the reason for that is specifically because when George H.W. Bush became president in 1989, one of his signature initiatives was to raise the Veterans Administration to a cabinet level position as the Department of Veteran Affairs. And once that was accomplished, one of the first things that the VA did was to initiate a comprehensive survey of the historic significance of the old VA hospitals. And so out of that, basically this was something that came not from locals saying, gee whiz, we need to, recognize that complex for what it is, but it was actually the George H.W. Bush administration doing that as part of a comprehensive policy at the national level.
Wow.
And there'll actually be a couple of images of the complex in more historic homes because among the preserved buildings there are the chief medical officer's house, two duplexes for the medical officers and the nurses' building, all there and in a pretty good state of repair.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a public building and it's also folks' residences.
Yeah, and they've had steady funds to keep them up. I mean,
Yeah.
and the grounds are beautiful.
Yeah.
It's really a neat location.
Yeah, hopefully that will continue.
Yeah. The U.S. Courthouse, which is a building on Franklin, right beside Union Hall. If you may drive, kind of sandwiched between Union Hall and the old Waco Trib new Magnolia headquarter building. Yeah.
Right. And that was one where I was really kind of mystified about the architect of that building because, as is the case with most buildings from the 20s and 30s that are federal courthouses alike, it almost always gives the architect as the supervising architect of the Treasury, which is Louis A. Simon in this case. And every post office in the United States from this era you go to, his name is on the cornerstone.
Yeah, it was busy.
Yeah, and of course he wasn't doing he was managing the very large office, and there's a ton of architects in the office who were turning out courthouses and post offices and veterans administrations, hospitals, and all of that sort of stuff. Well, in doing the research for this volume, I came across an interview with the architect of the building, who was a guy named W.H. Schimmelpfennig, and which is a mouthful to say. You
practice that.
And having written about German Texans, I got mighty used to it. But he was actually from Texas, but not from the Waco area, but ended up becoming an architect. And the challenge for a building like this in the Great Depression is, once again, the need to have it stylish and presentable, but not breaking the bank. And I think this really tests the limit of how little you can spend to make it not break the bank. The style-giving elements here tend to be focused on the main door and the window immediately above it. They're projecting pavilions at each corner, which are very simple, and there's a prominent window at the base of each of those. The row of tiles as well. It's not really clear, if you really looking at it from most sides, that the building is in fact U-shaped, which was to encourage natural ventilation. This was at a point where very few buildings had air conditioning in them, and so it was still very much the ceiling fan and that's about it. The other thing that had never really been clear to me was the importance of the location for the post office, because this is on Franklin, as you were mentioning, and it backs up to Mary. So once again, the railroad tracks were right there, and so for the post office, you wanted that easy connection to the railroad, which could get letters delivered to you more quickly, and your letters out of town delivered more quickly as well. So the post office was actually the back part of the building. It's been somewhat obscured even further by the fact that there's an addition that was placed on it at a later date, but done in a compatible style. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting building that I would think most people wouldn't know what it is. So, let's jump ahead to education.
Sure.
So I wondered if there was going to be a Buildings of Baylor, but you've already shot that with your inclusions of several historic. You stayed on the quad, but that kind of historic core of Baylor University, Old Main Burleson, Carroll Science, and Carroll Library. I'm interested in maybe just some insights and looking into them this time, and what you learned about those structures.
Yeah, well, I think that I saw this as my opportunity to say what I had to say.
Yeah.
About Baylor without doing a book that would be dedicated to the entirety of the campus.
Sure.
And part of that is because, in the modern era, there was a tendency to build things that rejected the earlier Baylor buildings and just do something completely different, which sometimes did not turn out well. But over and above that, I'm a historian, not an architecture critic.
Yeah.
And so when you sort of move it out of its historic context, it's not as suggestive to me. My goal here is not necessarily to tell people what's the most beautiful buildings in Waco.
Sure.
It is quite explicitly historic buildings in Waco. And the notion of, well, what makes it historic, there are certain things that a building from, whenever the 1880s is going to have that other times will not. Those sort of issues interest me more than saying why a building is aesthetically successful or not.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the campus, it's sort of a coming out party part 2 for Birch Easterwood, who was, made a huge impact on Waco houses. Mm-hmm. And so Historic Homes of Waco was the first time he'd ever been looked at in any sort of comprehensive manner. And it turns out that he had become very integrated with the Baylor administration starting in the 1920s. So all of the buildings from the 20s and 30s have his stamp upon it, although they end up being different. There were some funding issues, like for Women's Memorial Dorm. There was a great deal of alumni fundraising that shifted that. So Birch Easterwood Part 2 is the way in which he and President Brooks worked closely together, starting with the old Brooks Hall, but going all the way up to Pat Neff Hall, which is one of the iconic buildings of Waco.
Yeah,
and that is certainly one of the most important buildings in Easterwood's career, though he did come back to give the university what they wanted on Tidwell Bible Building, which there's a whole long story with regard to that, which resulted in the firing of the original architect. And they knew that Easterwood would deliver a building that was presentable and on budget. Mm-hmm. And so he and by this time his son Kenneth Easterwood came back for one last hurrah at Baylor. I found myself in terms of the earlier Baylor buildings being very interested in Carroll Science and Carroll Library, which is the phase 2 buildings. You have Old Main and Georgia Burleson as phase 1, and then you get really just a matter of 13, 14 years later, the next generation of buildings and moving from the Victorian into the neoclassical. And the thing that was so striking about that, this is another one where I've just always wondered, no one ever says who the architects were or whatever. And it turns out that the architects were Messer and Smith of Fort Worth. And of course, the next question becomes, who the heck are Messer and Smith of Fort Worth? And it turns out that they were both English emigre architects who came from England to Cowtown and hung out their shingle as architects. And Howard Messer and S. Wemyss Smith had a partnership for just a while. And so these are very good examples of the work that they did. S. Wemyss Smith ended up moving to Oklahoma City and became one of the architects for the Oklahoma State Capitol.
Oh, wow.
So that becomes his most famous building. But it was interesting finding that there was the use on Carroll Science and Carroll Library of Luder's stone. And once again, those were quarries out in Jones County, north of Abilene, that those hadn't existed, and the combination of the train tie-in and the opening of that quarry allowed Baylor to use that for the base on both of the buildings, and then a modern pressed brick from St. Louis for the upper stories. And so they're very much buildings of their time, and incorporating, these new materials and incorporating the new neoclassical style.
Okay, I decided as we talked, we're going to do buildings of Baylor sometime, because I want to make sure we get attention to some of these other buildings. And one that I think is a really interesting building in the moment because of dreams about his future is William Decker Johnson Hall, which was really a landmark building when it was built for Paul Quinn campus, a very modern building built in the 20s, I believe, early 20s. So some of you know it as that building that's boarded up and kind of sitting on Garrison Street, right outside the multipurpose center there in East Waco. But tell us a little bit about why William Decker Johnson Hall is significant.
Yeah, well, it's actually, I'm going to have to calculate here, but I'm thinking, it's the second oldest building that remains from the Paul Quinn campus.
Yeah.
And that had been Waco's, historically, one of Waco's two historically black colleges. There was one over in North Waco as well, which was associated with the Baptist congregations, and then Paul Quinn College was associated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I actually enjoyed doing research on Paul Quinn because it was another one where you hear the same five things. And, when you move beyond, what were the earlier buildings? How did they relate? And so that was something that I found rewarding, to see the sort of energy and determination that the folks who built Paul Quinn College had. And one of the most visionary things happened in the early 1920s when they decided to hire William Sidney Pittman of Dallas. And he's not necessarily a brand name figure in our sort of modern public consciousness, but for Texas architectural historians, he's known as the first professional black architect, and a very important figure in the state. And one of his churches still stands in Waxahachie, and others in Houston, buildings in Dallas as well. So it was kind of a get for the Paul Quinn administration to be able to convince him to come and work on the building. I was very excited when I came across the evidence of his doing work for Paul Quinn. Is one of those things where the connection became much better documented because we now have digitized a lot of historically black newspapers, and the newspaper from Dallas, which is escaping my.
Is that I know the newspaper you're talking about.
Yeah, I guess we could cheat and look in the.
Yeah.
I will mention that there's not a footnote anywhere to be seen in the text of the book, but you can actually flip and find out that
Examiner?
The Dallas Express very frequently provided information about William Sidney Pittman. And in fact, it was interesting because in terms of these projects, the ad in the Dallas Express would say, you can see a copy of the plans in Waco at the college or at Mr. Pittman's office here in Dallas. And he was in that area that's now referred to as Deep Ellum.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the prominent multi-story building that's now a trendy hotel was designed by him, which has been left forlorn for long. So I hope that it's been sufficiently respectful of what he did. So yeah, the building is, somewhat like Henry L. Spicer among white architects. William Sidney Pittman is looking to give the biggest bang for the buck to his clients, both in terms of having a building that was spacious and structurally sound, but also, with enough ornamentation to dignify it as being an important building. And so in that regard, you get the nice front porch here with the pairs of steps and the shady porch that's there. I guess I should mention that William Sidney Pittman had gone to the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and ended up working at Tuskegee with Robert R. Taylor, who designed the Tuskegee campus and is very well known as a pioneering Black architect in America. He, in fact, was the first Black man to graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's School of Architecture.
Okay.
So there's a sense in which his connection with Tuskegee is more than just sort of a gee whiz. It speaks to how he came to have the training and skill that he had. He also ended up marrying Portia Washington, who was the daughter of Booker T. Washington. So I think in Black society in Texas, in Dallas in particular, they were probably like this, royal couple that they were, esteemed for his professional skill and esteemed for her background as the daughter of the founder of an important historically Black college. So an interesting story. I think it does have somewhat of a sad ending in that I think Pittman ended up being very frustrated that the commissions that he got tended to be small and low budget, just out of the nature of the low budget that a historically Black college could provide. I mean, they were struggling against racism in the 1920s as they had from long before, and he ended up turning to drink as which I think is really sort of his solace in whatever degree it can actually bring solace. But it also ended up breaking up his marriage because Portia ended up moving back to Alabama, and William Sidney Pittman stayed here, but he became less productive. But I think this is an excellent example of his work, and I'm glad that it's been identified by people other than me. Sometimes I get nervous going out on a limb here in terms of reading through the Dallas Express and other newspapers. There were a number of mentions of building projects at Paul Quinn, and matching that one up to the one that's specifically designed by Pittman was a bit of a challenge, but it certainly fits within the parameters of what he was doing in the 1920s.
I see. Okay. Well, let's jump ahead into Chapter 7.
What's Chapter 7?
Chapter 7 is the Masonic buildings and museums of Waco.
Yes.
And I think because of Waco's central location, we were well positioned to have the brotherhoods around.
It certainly seems that way. I think, too, that there was a very aggressive move on the part of our locals. Ed Rotan was one of the leaders of the move from Waco, from Houston to Waco. And Houston had been the home of the Masonic Lodge from its founding, way back whenever that was. I don't know if that was 1830s or 40s, but yeah, it's a little strange and confusing. I hopping to the Grand Masonic Lodge of 1947-49. One of the confusing things about it is that the out front, it incorporates the cornerstone of the previous Grand Masonic Lodge in Waco. And it was like, what the heck is this doing here? But it was, I appreciated it ultimately in terms of providing the backstory, but nobody knows it's the backstory. You're looking at this monumental sort of late Art Deco building, and it's like, why is there a cornerstone from 1904, which is when the lodge moved. And that was actually originally on Franklin Avenue. I guess it was around Franklin and South 6th Street. And actually a rather interesting building. And that sort of explains why that was a big time for Ed Roten being a community leader here in Waco. So they were able to make that, and I think it reflects that Texas was growing so much, and Waco had gone from being a frontier outpost to being something that was really centrally located with so many new communities growing up to the west of us, and so it was interesting looking at that in the context of the architects who were involved. They actually, for the current building, brought in Broad and Nelson of Dallas, and they were a pretty well-known firm, especially on commercial buildings. And Donald Nelson was actually an MIT graduate. And was also a Mason himself, so that he did the Masonic Temple in Dallas as well, the one in El Paso, and so that's the other thing that I enjoy in these volumes is thinking about the connections of other buildings in Texas or elsewhere. So it was interesting looking at this in terms of the Masonic symbolism that was incorporated, the two piers, those columns that are out front. One's a terrestrial globe, and the other is a celestial globe, a globe representing the patterns of the stars and the constellation and things like that. That the Masonic order was very keen to incorporate into their buildings, but a pretty impressive structure. But even the local Masonic Lodge, the one that's at Washington Avenue and 8th, I've always thought was a very nice structure, and one that's definitely by Milton W. Scott, the local Waco architect, and so it's one of the things that I found interesting there was that most of the Masonic buildings are on what would be considered the piano nobile, the floor of nobility, and that as in ancient Italy, commercial on the first floor, on the ground floor, and then the true first floor, and other things were above that. So just to find out that there was something called the New Temple Drugstore that was the anchor for this. Was something.
So the New Temple Drugstore was down on the first floor.
Yeah, I assume it was that corner space on the ground floor, and there was also a grocery store and a flower shop. So so there was a lot of, that's the way in which a building becomes part of the network of the community, and not just a single function. And in fact, I believe the proprietor and owner of the New Temple Drugstore, his house will be in more historic homes of Waco, Texas.
Okay, all right.
So stay tuned.
There's a good tease there. I think the Grand Karam Shrine Building is representative of maybe some of these orders, the challenges in holding on to some of these very large, expensive to maintain buildings.
Waco had so many interesting buildings. in the Masonic orders, and yeah, it's I don't know if we want to say overbuilt, but overbuilt. In the case of the Grand Kerem Shrine building, they actually made a conscious decision to move out of the downtown area. That goes back to the era of urban renewal and suburbanization, and so their little building, I believe, is off Cobb's, sort of near New Road, and it's kind of interesting, just making the comparison of the old and the new. The interesting thing here for me was that no one had identified this building as being by Herbert M. Green, who was another Dallas architect. I believe he was another Mason, but he was a prominent Dallas architect in the 20s, and this is a building of 1927, 28. But his firm was also very much involved in the design of the University of Texas campus. He was named the university architect, which he was supposed to be following a master plan there. But Garrison Hall, where I spent many a day when I was in graduate school in American Studies at UT, but Wagoner in biology and chemistry gym were all designed by him. But here in Waco, he's involved on the Masonic front rather than on the university front.
And we know the completion date of that building because it's very soon. Hotel 1928 will open up.
I'm pleased that they got the date right.
Yeah, they did. Get the date right. Well, Ken, I don't want to give everything away in the book, and we've covered a lot of ground, but I want you to step back a little bit, not physically. You don't have to step back because no one can see you if you do it. But I'm interested in kind of, as you take it as a whole and you think about this landscape of commercial structures and educational structures. I mean, all these public buildings really is what they all are. I mean, how is Waco maybe? What are some characteristics of that landscape of public structures? What are some conclusions, maybe some broader things that you draw from this examination? You don't write a conclusion. I'm asking you to make a conclusion.
Really, you ask hard questions, Stephen Slaon. The objective in doing this was, objective number one, as with historic homes, was to emphasize that there is a lot of interesting and significant historic buildings that remain in Waco. One of the legends that even today you can hear is, all the old stuff was demolished by the tornado in 1953.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of a simple statement, but hey, there's a whole lot of historic things here. I'm also very keen to emphasize that history moves on.
Yeah. That
the notion for the folks who were the founders of the historic Waco Foundation, as it used to be called back in the day, I think they would probably be horrified to see some of the newer buildings in here. That's not historic. Historic building is back in the day, pre-industrial or whatever. That there's a tremendous nostalgia for a certain way of life that seemed more attractive to them. So I've tried very hard to move away from that old historical understanding and to continue the story well into the 20th century and getting close to the present day, but still with enough time to give some historical distance. But to get to the core of the hard question that you asked, my feeling is that what I have found is that Waco went through so many of the same fashion phases and historical phases as the rest of Texas, as the rest of the South, in a lot of cases in the rest of the nation. that it is very much an American story. And I think while saying that, it's also important to say that there are certain things that do not happen in Waco. It's almost as if the absences are more prominent than, individual distinctions of the buildings that exist. And I'm thinking about that, one thing that sort of creeps in at the very end of Historic Homes is the fact that Wacoans were profoundly uninterested in modernism. And that would mean either the sort of avant-garde modernism of the Bauhaus and the International style, or of the sort of more friendly to the average viewer Art Deco style, which had more razzle-dazzle and razzmatazz to it. And that just never really took off in Waco. So it's interesting seeing that. And I don't know if that speaks to sobriety in a Waco way of thinking about how our buildings should present us to the rest of the world, or if it may be modernity as opposed to tradition, that Waco having set its roots down at a point when there was very traditional classical buildings, and so you get Earl Harrison House or the Fort House or the like. That had a very strong pull for the people who were the founders of historic Waco and other people. So the modernity came about actually less in modern buildings, but in modern ways of arranging the city, and the sort of flight to the suburbs, and the creating of a new main street of Valley Mills and the like. So that I think that that's something that undergirds a lot of this, that you see, the decisions that people are making as to whether to stay or whether to go. I mean, the building that's now Saronia, the shop, was Saks Fifth Avenue, which was a women's clothing store, but specifically there to get away from the congestion of the town square. And to a generation that's used to hearing the urban renewal diss of downtown as being slummy and run down, and no one wants to go there. But in the case of Saks Austin Avenue, and also the grocery store that was very near that, they both moved there in the 50s specifically because the parking was difficult in the downtown area. So downtown was okay. And they did not move that far out. It was not really a flight from the city like you end up seeing in the 50s, and moving further out into new suburbs and the like.
Well, what I love about the book, I'll tell you what I like about the book. Tell me. It really puts historic buildings in kind of the lived landscape of life in Waco, from where I eat to where I shop to where I might worship to where I may socialize. It's all in here. To think of those places as historic, also not these places behind velvet ropes that have visiting hours, but to think about the historic landscape much more broadly than that, I think is a big contribution that the book makes.
Well, thank you.
And I'm encouraged also to see some of these properties are being stewarded well, but there's also, if you look in these pages, some great opportunities for someone to step up to the plate and make sure these buildings are
definitely
in your revised edition you're going to come out with in 10 years. So
we shall see.
Well, Ken, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast, and I'll have you back
Yeah.
at some point. We'll do buildings of Baylor, and then, of course, when we get more historic homes, we got to talk about those as well.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ken.
Ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.
I married a guy I knew most of my life. We knew each other in high school and even went to prom together. But little did I know, I did not know him at all. I will call my now ex-husband Dirty Chad.
Hey y'all, this is April
And this is Caroline.
with Bloody Happy Hour.
And we are bringing to you Dirty Chad. Get it on patreon.com/bloodyhappyhour exclusively for all the details and all the red flags.
Caroline's finally telling her story.
My truth.
Hi, I'm Hank. You might remember me from a show called King of the Hill. Check out a King of the Hill rewatch podcast. These boys ain't right, but they are funny. Find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts or at roguemedianetwork.com. I tell you what.